Hello 7th graders, this is Mr. Warrington, and this is our second lesson, lesson number 2 on the scientific method. We'll have one more short lesson after this one. This one isn't very long, but there's a lot of really important information in it. And I don't expect you to understand all of it from this video because we will talk about all of these different things that are in this in class, but at least you'll have a little bit of background going into that. So make sure that you have your notes. Remember, you can pause at any time. You can replay a little segment if you need to, and hopefully this helps you in some ways to be able to keep up with the lecture. Alright, so let's get started. Okay, the first step in the scientific method was to develop a problem, or to establish the problem. The second step is to form a hypothesis. And as you may know, a hypothesis is basically an educated guess as to the answer to the problem that we're trying to solve. So in order to make it an educated guess before developing a hypothesis, a scientist must do research to find out what is already known about their subject. It's likely that other people have already done research in the area that you're looking at, and you can actually learn from what they've learned. You might even find the answer to your question before you go any further. Or some of the information that they've already learned will help direct your research so that it's more efficient and so that you can come up with an answer easier. And then, of course, this will allow the scientist to develop an educated guess as to the answer to his or her question. Now, a hypothesis has several characteristics to it, and all of these are really, really important. You need to know these different elements. So first of all, a hypothesis, as we said, is a suggested solution to a problem. It isn't the answer to the problem, it's a suggested solution, because the next step after forming a hypothesis will be to test the hypothesis either with an experiment or a survey. So a hypothesis, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time talking tonight, but a hypothesis is a suggested solution to a problem. A hypothesis predicts an outcome. And I think this is the one that really helps students a lot if they think about it, if they think about a hypothesis in terms of it being a prediction. And I think that will help you to understand how to write a good hypothesis. You just simply come up with a prediction to what you think will happen in a certain situation. Another characteristic of a hypothesis is that it must be testable. We should be able to make an experiment or to develop a survey in order to determine whether or not our hypothesis is correct. And lastly, a hypothesis is written in the form of a statement. The problem is written in the form of a question. A hypothesis is written in the form of a statement in terms of what we think the answer to our question or our problem is. Lastly, the hypothesis identifies the independent and dependent variables. And we're going to talk about what independent and dependent variables are. And they're probably, this section right here, these two concepts are probably the two most important concepts that you'll get out of this particular lesson. And if you can write a good hypothesis, or maybe I should put it differently, if you can identify, if you understand the independent and dependent variables in the question that you're asking, then it makes writing a a hypothesis very, very easy. Okay, so let's talk about independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is the variable that is changed on purpose in an experiment. When the scientist begins their experiment, there is something that they're going to change, that they are going to experiment with. And that variable that they are experimenting with is called the independent variable. The other variable, the dependent variable, is the variable that changes in response to the change made to the independent variable. Now, I know this sounds kind of confusing, but there's a couple of things that we can use to help us keep these straight. So what we can do here is we can take a look at the independent variable. We make a change, and then that change causes something else to change. And that other thing that is caused to change is the dependent variable. So the best way to sum this up is to remember this little phrase right here. If you remember this phrase, if you memorize it, then you will understand independent and dependent variables much more easily. And that is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. That's why it's called the dependent variable. Any change that's made to the independent variable will cause a change in the dependent variable. And I'll give some examples here in a couple of minutes, because I know a few of you right now are just thinking to yourself, this makes no sense at all. But it will as we start to look at examples, I promise. Okay? Another way of thinking about it as well is that the dependent variable is the variable that is measured and recorded. Whenever you take data, that data that you're writing down comes from the dependent variable. So, let's look at an example. An example of a hypothesis might be if salamanders are exposed to polluted soil, then their offspring will have curved tails. So this is our hypothesis, and if you remember, I said that a good hypothesis, or a correctly written hypothesis, will identify the independent variable, and it will also identify the dependent variable. Okay? So let's think about what's going on here. First of all, what is the independent variable? And then what is the dependent variable? So let's think about it. What is the scientist changing? And then what depends on the thing that is changing? So as we take a look at this, we see it says if salamanders are exposed to polluted soil. Okay? So polluted soil as opposed to normal soil. So that is the thing that is being changed. Okay? So the independent variable in this case is going to be pollution in the soil. Now, what do we think will change as a result of the polluted soil? I want you to stop for a second, and I want you to write out, looking at the hypothesis, what the scientist thinks will change if we add pollution to the soil. All right, so you've had a moment here to think about this. You typed out an answer. So let's take a look. Well, the scientist thinks that if we add pollution to the soil, then the shape of the salamander's tails will change. They'll have curved tails. So curved tails is our dependent variable. Now let's go back and think about that phrase. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So as we look at these two, pollution in soil, curved tails, which one depends on the other ones? On the other one. Well, curved tails, the shape of the tail, the scientists think depends on whether or not there's pollution in the soil. So that's what that phrase means. So you want to look for the one that depends on the other one. So the one that depends on the other one is the dependent variable, and the one that the scientist changes, in this case, adding pollution to the soil, or maybe even the amount of pollution in the soil, would be the independent variable. Okay, so once the hypothesis is established, the scientist needs to test the hypothesis. And to do that, so this is our third step, to do that, the scientist will conduct either an experiment or a survey. Now, before starting, the scientist will need to design that experiment or survey. He just doesn't start out, and he actually has to think about several different things. And one of those things the scientist has to do is to identify what are called the experimental and control variables. So we talked about independent and dependent variables, which you can identify in the hypothesis, and actually which you would use to help write your hypothesis. But then for the experiment itself, we have experimental variables and we have control variables. So these are two things that you need to keep separate from independent and dependent. So you have independent and dependent variables, which we talked about and which we'll talk about in class, and we'll work with some examples. And then we have experimental and control variables that we will pay attention to as we develop our experiment. Now, the experimental variable is the variable that's being tested, and actually it's the same thing as the independent variable. So really we're working with three different variables instead of four. It's just that one of them has two different names. And the name that it has depends on what you're comparing it to. For example, you are either a son or a daughter, okay? If you have siblings, you're also a brother or a sister. So even though you're the same person, you have two different names in terms of your relationship with others. Son or daughter, and a brother or sister, assuming that you have siblings. Okay? So, it's the same thing here with the experimental/independent variable, because it depends on what you're referring it to. So whether you're called a son or a daughter depends on whether or not we're comparing you to one of your parents, or if we're comparing you to your sibling. If we're comparing you to your parents, you're a son or daughter. If we're comparing you to or referencing you to a sibling, then you're a brother or a sister. So when we are talking about the experimental variable, we are comparing it to the control variable. When we call it an independent variable, that's when we are referencing it to the dependent variable. Okay? And I'll draw a diagram on the board in class to help you understand how this fits together. Now, control variables are different. They are the variables kept the same between different groups during the experiment. When we do an experiment, we need to keep all of the possible variables the same except for the one that we are changing. The reason for that is if there is a difference between the two groups, our experimental group and our control group, if we don't control the variables and there's a difference that occurs, we don't know if it's because of the experimental variable or if it's the result of something else. And so, as I just kind of mentioned, the experimenter makes a special effort to keep all variables except the experimental variable the same so that they will not affect the outcome. And as I said, this way we can know that any changes in the dependent variable are due to the independent variable and nothing else. So, I know that was a little bit confusing. We're going to look at an example here. So let's say we put 6 salamanders in a tank containing contaminated soil and 6 in a tank containing non-contaminated soil. So I want you to stop for a second and think, what is the experimental variable in this particular experiment? The two possibilities are going to be the type of soil, and then another one I suppose could be maybe the type of tank or something else like that. Well, the experimental variable in this case, as we said a little while ago, is going to be the type of soil that we use. But now what we have to think about, the variables that we need to control. The variables we need to keep the same between both groups. So what would be some things if we had 6 salamanders in one tank with some contaminated soil and 6 in a tank containing non-contaminated soil? What things would we want to make sure were the same between both groups of salamanders? So I want you to answer this question that's coming up, and I want you to type out at least a couple of different things that we would need to keep the same between both groups. All right, so let me share some different things that come off that I can think of off the top of my head, and I know some of you guys will come up with some that I didn't even think about. One thing we'd want to do is, first of all, make sure that our tanks are the same. That the tank that we put the non-contaminated soil in is the same as the tank that we put the contaminated soil in. Also, you can see here that we're putting the same number of salamanders in each tank. We would also want to have the same amount of water available. We would want to feed them the same kind of food. We would want to have them get the same amount of sunlight. We would want both tanks to be the same temperature. In other words, we would want everything possible that we can think of to be the same between both tanks, except for one thing, and that is whether or not the soil is contaminated, the type of soil. So all of those variables that are the same between both groups are what we call control variables, because they control the whole situation to make sure that the only thing is different is the experimental variable, in this case the type of soil. Now, the group or the groups that get the experimental variable are called experimental groups. So in this case, the salamanders in the aquarium with the polluted soil would be the experimental group, because we said that polluted soil is the experimental variable. The group that does not get the experimental variable is called the control group. And I like to think about this is, in some cases, it's the group that is normal, what we think of as being normal. And we would kind of expect, for the most part, that non-polluted soil would be normal. And we know that in this particular experiment as well, we said from the start that the contaminated soil is the experimental variable. And so this is really easy, because the group that gets the experimental variable is the experimental group. The other group is the control group. And the control group is something to compare the experimental group to see if there's any difference. Now, if both groups of salamanders came out with curved tails, then we would know it's not due to the soil. But if the experimental group, their tails are curved, and the ones in the control group, the one with the non-polluted soil, are straight, then we're pretty sure that our hypothesis was correct. Okay, so in our next video, we're going to start with classifying and analyzing data. But we will spend a couple of days in class talking more about experimental and control variables and talking about independent and dependent variables. Like I said, those are very, very important concepts to get, and so we're not just going to rush over it. We're going to make sure that you get it. Well, that's it for this lesson. All secure in Sector 7, and we will see you later. Bye-bye.